Ife had always been a patient woman. For 3 years, she stood by Ekene, a struggling entrepreneur with dreams as vast as the ocean, but resources as scarce as a desert. She believed in him, his passion, his resilience, and his constant assurances that success was just around the corner. The future he spoke of was vivid in her mind. A beautiful home, exotic vacations, and a thriving life built on the foundation of their love. But reality, as it often does, weighed heavily on Ife's shoulders. Ekene was earnest, yes, but his business ventures had not yielded much. He was barely scraping by, and though he showered her with affection, his ability to provide financially was lacking. Each day was a struggle to keep faith, especially as friends and family began to whisper words of doubt into her ears. "Ife, you're too beautiful for this life of waiting," her cousin Chika said one evening. "How long will you defend a man who can barely afford to take you out? You deserve more." Her best friend Amara echoed similar sentiments. "Girl, you're like a queen walking around with a pauper. Open your eyes. There are men out there who would give you the world without hesitation." Ife had resisted such talk for a long time. She knew Ekene loved her deeply, and she had once thought that love alone was enough. But now, after 3 years of hearing his repeated promises of a breakthrough that never came, the doubt was creeping in. Ekene's constant optimism seemed like empty words, and her patience was wearing thin. One evening, as Ife sat in front of her mirror, applying her makeup for yet another night out with Ekene that would likely end at a modest restaurant, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing out on something. Her mind began to entertain the idea that perhaps she could do better. Maybe it was time to explore other possibilities, keep her options open. She had been loyal for so long, hadn't she earned the right to see what else was out there? Ekene was unaware of the storm brewing within Ife's heart. He still saw her as his constant, his rock, the one person who believed in him when no one else did. He was on the cusp of what he believed to be his breakthrough. A major investor had shown interest in his latest business idea, and he was optimistic that this would finally be the turning point. If only Ife could hold on just a little longer. But while Ekene was planning their future, Ife was growing increasingly distant. She began to listen more closely to the sweet words of suitors who flocked around her, drawn to her beauty and charm. Then along came Akpan, a man unlike any other she had met before. Akpan was striking in every way. Tall, with a commanding presence that demanded attention the moment he entered a room, his sharp features and perfectly tailored suits made him irresistible. Women fawned over him, but Akpan's attention was focused solely on Ife. There was something magnetic about him, an air of mystery that only deepened the more she got to know him. His past was a puzzle, and he never spoke much about his background, but Ife found herself captivated by his confidence and allure. She pushed her concerns aside, thinking that perhaps some men just preferred to keep their personal lives private. It wasn't just his looks that caught her attention, it was the way he lavished her with gifts. Every time they met, Akpan would surprise her with something new. A diamond bracelet, a designer handbag, a pair of shoes imported from Italy. He was attentive, always making sure she had everything she desired. Ife began to feel like a queen in his presence. Gone were the days of struggling alongside Ekene. With Akpan, she didn't have to wait for promises to materialize. Everything she wanted was already at her feet. After 4 weeks of whirlwind romance and luxury, Akpan proposed to Ife. His proposal was as grand as everything else about him. A surprise engagement party at a 5-star hotel, with an array of expensive gifts and a diamond ring that sparkled brighter than any star. It felt like a fairy tale, and Ife agreed to marry him without a second thought. Her dreams of a lavish life seemed to be falling perfectly into place. When Ife broke the news to Ekene, it was like shattering a mirror in slow motion. She found him at his modest apartment, working late into the night. The sight of him, hunched over his paperwork, contrasted sharply with the opulence of her recent experiences with Akpan. "Ekene," Ife began, her voice trembling despite her resolve, "I'm getting married. I've been seeing someone else, and he just proposed, and I've accepted." Ekene looked up from his desk, his face going pale. He seemed momentarily stunned, then a look of desperation crossed his features. "Ife, please, don't do this. I know I've promised a lot, and things haven't been easy, but I'm so close to a breakthrough." This investment could change everything for us. Tears welled up in Ife's eyes. Ekene, I've been patient for so long. I supported you through every setback, every failed venture. But it's been 3 years. I can't wait any longer for something that may never come. Akpan is offering me everything I've ever wanted. Ekene's voice was filled with anguish. But we built something together. Don't you remember the dreams we had? The plans we made? I need just a little more time. I swear this time it's real. I can't lose you now. Ife felt a pang of guilt. She had once loved Ekene deeply, and it was painful to see him so broken. But her mind was already made up. The allure of security and the glamorous life Akpan offered had become too enticing to ignore. I'm sorry, Ekene, she said softly. I wish things could be different, but I have to think about my future. I need stability and happiness now, not just promises. Ekene's shoulders slumped as he watched Ife turn to leave. I understand, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I just hope you find what you're looking for. The door closed behind Ife, and as she walked away from Ekene, she felt a mix of relief and sadness. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back. The future she had envisioned with Akpan was now within reach, and she was determined to embrace it fully. As the wedding approached, Ife's life became a whirlwind of chaos. The preparations were consuming her every moment, but nothing prepared her for the surprise that awaited her on the day of the traditional marriage ceremony. When the day finally arrived, the ceremony was set to be a grand affair. The venue was adorned with vibrant fabrics and intricate decorations, and the air was filled with excitement. However, when Akpan arrived, Ife's family was taken aback. He came alone, without any family members or relatives accompanying him. The absence of Akpan's family was a bit of a concern for Ife's extended family, who had come in full force to celebrate the occasion. They murmured among themselves, casting curious glances at the solitary figure of Akpan. The situation was strange and somewhat unsettling, but the allure of Akpan's wealth and the promise of future benefits overshadowed any immediate concerns. Ife's parents, though initially surprised, quickly dismissed their unease. They were eager to see their daughter marry into a wealthy family and benefit from the connections and resources Akpan could offer. They exchanged knowing glances and ensured the ceremony proceeded without interruption, putting aside their misgivings. The traditional marriage went on with grand celebrations and lavish displays, with Akpan playing the role of the charming and attentive groom. Ife, caught up in the euphoria of her new life, chose to overlook the absence of Akpan's family. She was swept away by the opulence and excitement of her new reality. Despite the outward perfection of the ceremony, Ife's mind occasionally wandered to the strange circumstances. She couldn't help but wonder about the mysterious nature of Akpan's family. Why were they absent? Where were they? Akpan had given vague excuses about family obligations and business commitments, but Ife couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. As the days passed, Ife and Akpan settled into their new life as a married couple, but something was amiss. Akpan's behavior became increasingly strange after their wedding. He barely spoke during the day, spending his time locked away in his office or bedroom. Then, at night, he would leave the house, returning only in the early hours of the morning. When Ife asked him where he went, Akpan always told her it was for work. At first, Ife tried to be understanding. She knew Akpan was involved in high-level business deals, and she reasoned that maybe this was just how things worked in his world. But as the pattern continued, her concerns grew. Every night, as she lay alone in their bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "Ife, I told you before," Akpan would say when she confronted him, his voice calm but firm. "You need to trust me. My work is complicated, and it's not something I can explain easily. But I promise, I'm doing this for us, for our future." But trust was becoming harder for Ife. The secrecy, the unexplained absences, and the refusal to let her in weighed heavily on her. She felt more alone than ever, trapped in a marriage where her husband was a stranger during the day and a phantom at night. When their first daughter Anew was born, Ife hoped things would change. She imagined that fatherhood would bring Akpan closer to her, that maybe he would open up and spend more time at home. But nothing changed. Akpan continued his nocturnal routine, disappearing into the night and returning just before dawn. He adored Eno, showering her with affection when he was home, but his absences loomed over their lives like a dark cloud. Months turned into years, and soon their second child, a son named Bassi, was born. Ifi tried to hold on to hope, but the growing unease in her heart was impossible to ignore. She couldn't help but notice that none of Akpan's family members ever visited, not even to celebrate the birth of their children. Not a single relative had come to see Eno or Bassi, and when she asked Akpan about it, his answers were vague and evasive. "My family is distant," he would say, offering no further explanation. "They have their own lives, their own obligations. Don't worry about them." But Ifi couldn't help worrying. It wasn't just the absence of his family, it was the mystery that shrouded every aspect of Akpan's life. She had tried so hard to be patient, to trust him, but as time went on, it became harder to ignore the growing chasm between them. She felt as though she was living with a ghost, someone who was physically present but emotionally distant, hiding behind walls she couldn't break down. One night, after another long day of caring for the children, Ifi decided she had had enough. She needed answers. She couldn't continue living in the dark, wondering what her husband was hiding from her. When Akpan returned home in the early morning, just as the sun was beginning to rise, Ifi was waiting for him in the living room. "Akpan," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "we need to talk." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "What is it, Ifi?" "It's late. I'm tired." "I can't keep living like this," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "I've tried to be patient, to trust you, but I can't do it anymore. You disappear every night, you refuse to tell me where you go, and your family is nowhere to be found. I've had 2 children with you, and I don't even know who you really are." Akpan sighed and sat down on the couch, rubbing his temples as if the weight of the conversation was already exhausting him. "Ifi, I told you before, my work is complicated. It's not something I can just explain. You have to trust me." "Trust you?" Ifi said, her voice rising. "How can I trust you when you won't tell me anything? You've kept me in the dark for years. I'm your wife, Akpan. I deserve to know what's going on. I deserve to know the truth." For a long moment, Akpan was silent. He stared at the floor as if contemplating something deep and difficult. Finally, he looked up at her, his eyes dark and serious. "Ifi," he said quietly, "there are things about me, about my life, that you don't want to know. Things that could put you and the children in danger. That's why I've kept them from you, not because I don't trust you, but because I'm trying to protect you." Ifi shook her head, frustration and fear bubbling to the surface. "Protect us from what, Akpan? What is it that you're so afraid of?" But Akpan only stood up, avoiding her gaze. "I can't explain it now," he said, "but I think it's time I introduced you to my family members. Get ready. We leave in 3 days." Ifi's heart skipped a beat, excitement mingling with relief. Finally, she would get the answers she had been longing for, the chance to meet the family Akpan had kept hidden for so long. She quickly busied herself with preparations, packing her things and the children's belongings, eager for the journey that would hopefully bring her closer to understanding her husband. On the 3rd day, they set off as one big family, the car filled with the excited chatter of Eno and Bassi, who were thrilled about the adventure. Akpan, however, remained mostly quiet throughout the drive. He seemed lost in thought, as though something was weighing heavily on his mind. Ifi noticed his silence, but decided not to press him. She was too focused on the upcoming meeting with his family to worry about his mood. After 2 long days on the road, they finally arrived at Akpan's village. As they approached, Ifi noticed a change in her husband. His eyes brightened, and a wave of nostalgia washed over him. The sight of familiar landscapes and old memories seemed to lift his spirits. "This is where I grew up," Akpan said, his voice softening as he pointed out various landmarks. He shared stories of his childhood, of days spent playing with friends, of running through the fields and swimming in the stream they were now passing by. "That stream," he said, nodding toward the sparkling water that flowed gently nearby, "was my favorite place. I spent most of my days there as a boy, dreaming and playing. It was a special place for me." Ifi listened intently, touched by the rare glimpse into Akpan's past. She watched as he drove them to the stream, where they got out of the car and spent some time exploring the area. Eno and Bassi splashed around in the shallow water, their laughter echoing through the quiet countryside. After a while, Akpan turned to Ife, his expression thoughtful. "I need to go pick up something," he said, his voice carrying a hint of hesitation. "I'll meet you at the family compound. It's not far from here. Just follow the road straight ahead until you see a large mango tree on the right. Take the path to the left of the tree and you'll find the compound at the end." Ife nodded, a little disappointed that Akpan wouldn't be with them for the final leg of the journey, but she understood that he had his reasons. "Okay," she said, giving him a reassuring smile. "We'll see you there." With that, Akpan gave her the car keys and stood to watch them drive off, leaving Ife and the children to make their way to his family compound. The path was easy enough to follow, and Ife found herself filled with anticipation as they walked through the village. The air was fresh, and the surroundings were peaceful, a stark contrast to the tension she had felt in recent months. When they finally reached the compound, Ife stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding. The place was eerily quiet, and the large old house that stood before them looked weathered and worn. It was a far cry from the luxurious home she had imagined Akpan's family would live in. She hesitated for a moment, glancing down at Eno and Bassi, who were clinging to her hands. "This must be it," she said, more to herself than to the children. "Let's go inside." They approached the entrance, and Ife knocked on the large wooden door. The sound echoed through the silence, and for a moment she wondered if anyone was even home. Just as she was about to knock again, the door creaked open. An elderly woman stood in the doorway, her face lined with age, but her eyes sharp and alert. She looked at Ife and the children with a mixture of curiosity and surprise. The elderly woman looked at Ife with a mixture of confusion and concern. Her brows furrowed, and she tilted her head slightly. "Who are you, and how may I help you?" she asked in a cautious tone. Ife took a deep breath and smiled, though her nerves were starting to creep in. "I'm Ife," she said gently. "I came here with my husband, Akpan. He told me this is his family home. These are our children, Eno and Bassi. He said this is where he grew up." The woman's expression changed from confusion to disbelief. She shook her head slowly. "I'm sorry, dear," she said, her voice almost apologetic. "But no one by the name of Akpan has ever lived here. You must be mistaken." Ife's heart skipped a beat. She blinked, trying to process what she had just heard. "No, that can't be," she insisted. "Akpan gave me directions here. He grew up here. He told me stories about this village, the stream nearby. This has to be the place." The elderly woman's face remained puzzled. "I've lived in this village my entire life," she said, her voice firmer now. "I know everyone here. No man named Akpan grew up in this house." A wave of unease washed over Ife. She felt a chill creeping up her spine as doubt began to take root in her mind. Desperate to prove that there had been some sort of misunderstanding, she quickly pulled out her phone. She scrolled through her photos until she found a picture of Akpan. A candid shot of him, smiling with Eno and Bassi. "Here," Ife said, handing the phone to the woman. "This is Akpan, my husband." The woman took the phone in her weathered hands and stared at the image. Her face shifted, a mixture of shock and something else, fear, passing over her features. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked up at Ife, her eyes now wide with alarm. "Where did you meet this man?" the woman asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The burden weighed heavily on her, and for the first time in her life, Ife felt truly lost. She had left Ekene, a man who had loved her through thick and thin, for a life of material wealth, and now she was paying the price. As she gathered her children and prepared to leave the village, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of regret. She thought about Ekene, about the promises he had made, the struggles they had faced together. She had given up on him when he needed her most, and now she was paying the ultimate price. With a heavy heart, as Ife was about to climb into the car with Eno and Bassi, a group of elderly women who looked serious and were humming with palm leaves in their mouths surrounded her. Her children Eno and Bassi, who were really terrified at this point, clutched onto her tightly, but before she could ask what was happening, they grabbed her forcefully, separating her from her children. She desperately cried for help with no luck, as everyone stood and stared as though they all knew what was going on. Ife's heart sank as the elderly women surrounded her, their weathered hands gripping her tightly. She struggled and pleaded with them, tears streaming down her face, but her cries fell on deaf ears. Akpan's old mother, who had first told her the truth about Akpan, stood by silently, her gaze filled with pity but no intent to intervene. They separated her from her children, Eno and Bassi, who screamed for their mother, their innocent cries piercing the air. But Ife was powerless to stop them. She watched helplessly as the villagers dragged her away from the house and towards the village shrine. Her head spun with confusion and fear. What was happening? How had things spiraled so terribly out of control? All she wanted was to leave this cursed village and return to her life in the city. But now she was caught in a web of ancient traditions and superstitions that she had no understanding of. When they reached the shrine, the women began to shave her head, chanting in low voices as tufts of her hair fell to the ground. Ife cried harder, begging them to stop, but their hands were steady and their faces remained stoic. The entire ordeal felt surreal, like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Then, as if to further confirm her worst fears, they brought in a tattered old coffin. It was weathered and broken, as though it had been sitting for years untouched. The sight of it made Ife's stomach churn. She recoiled in horror, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Why are you doing this to me?" Ife sobbed, her voice barely above a whisper. One of the elderly women stepped forward, her voice steady and unfeeling. "Your husband, Akpan, brought you here to fulfill the burial rites that were never completed. His soul could not rest because he was denied the proper passage. Now you must wash his bones and drink the water. Only then will his spirit find peace, and only then can you leave this place." Ife's entire body went cold. The idea of touching, let alone washing, the bones of a man she had unknowingly married was horrifying enough, but drinking the water from his bones. It was too much. She couldn't do it. She wouldn't. She had to find a way out of this madness. "I can't do this," Ife pleaded. "Please let me go. I have children. I need to take care of them." The women were unmoved by her desperation. "The rites must be completed," one of them said firmly. "You have taken from this village, lived off the wealth of a man who is no longer among the living. You must give him peace so that his spirit does not torment us all." They took her phone and locked her in a small, dimly lit room in the shrine. There was no way to call for help, no way to contact anyone from the outside world. She was trapped. The next 3 days passed in a fog of dread. Each moment felt like an eternity as Ife sat alone in the room, her mind racing with thoughts of escape. She tried to plan her way out, but the guards stationed at the door were vigilant, and the village was far too remote for her to slip away unnoticed. Her children were kept in another part of the village, and every time she thought of them, her heart ached. On the 3rd day, the women came for her. They led her to the coffin, which now sat in the middle of the shrine, ominous and heavy with the weight of what was to come. The ritual began. They opened the coffin, revealing the dry, brittle bones of Akpan. Ife gagged at the sight, her body trembling uncontrollably. The women handed her a cloth and a basin of water. She was to wash his bones, rinse them carefully, and then, when the ritual was complete, drink the water that had touched his remains. Her hands shook violently as she reached for the cloth. The world around her felt unreal, like she had been thrown into an ancient nightmare from which there was no escape. She could hardly comprehend what she was doing, her mind too numb from fear and grief to process it all. When she finally finished, the women brought her the water. Ife stared at the basin, her stomach churning with disgust and fear. She couldn't do it. She wouldn't, but the women's stern faces surrounded her, their eyes full of expectation. "Drink," one of them ordered. "If you wish to leave this village with your children, you must drink." Tears streamed down Ife's face as she slowly raised the basin to her lips. She hesitated, her body frozen with revulsion. But the thought of her children kept her going. She had to survive this for them. With a trembling hand, Ife's hands shook as the basin hovered near her lips, the foul smell of the water assaulting her senses. She was on the verge of breaking down completely when the air suddenly erupted with the sharp crack of gunshots. She dropped the basin in shock, the water splashing onto the ground as the village women scattered, screaming in fear. Ife's heart raced as she saw a group of men burst through the doors of the shrine, guns raised and shouting commands. She blinked in disbelief as she recognized the familiar figure leading them. Ekene, her ex-lover. He stormed in with a look of fierce determination, flanked by a group of police officers. The villagers fell to the ground in submission as the police moved swiftly to disarm and detain anyone who posed a threat. Ekene rushed to Ife's side, kneeling before her with a look of concern that nearly broke her. "Ife, are you all right?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Tears poured from Ife's eyes as she nodded, too overcome to speak. Relief washed over her as she looked into Ekene's face, unable to believe he had come for her after everything. She never imagined she would see him again, much less in a moment of such desperation. "How did you know?" she finally managed to ask, her voice shaky. Ekene glanced at the police, who were securing the area, then turned back to her. "My younger sister is a doctor. She was posted to this village a few weeks ago," he explained quickly. "She recognized you when she saw you, even though you've changed a lot. She called me immediately, and when she told me what was happening here, I couldn't just sit by. I knew I had to come and get you out." Ife's heart swelled with emotion. The tears wouldn't stop. She thought about how foolish she had been to leave him, to give up on him when he had done nothing but love her. And here he was, risking everything to save her after she had chosen another man. You came for me," Ife whispered, her voice cracking. Ekene gently lifted her to her feet. "Of course I did," he said softly, his eyes searching hers. "I could never abandon you, Ife. Not after everything we've been through." Ife sobbed and threw her arms around Ekene, clinging to him tightly as the reality of what she had been through crashed over her. She felt his strong arms wrap around her, holding her close, and for the first time in weeks, she felt safe. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for coming back for me." Ekene pulled back slightly, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and something deeper. Something that told Ife he had never stopped caring for her, despite the distance that had grown between them. "I'll always come back for you, Ife," he said softly, "no matter what." The police quickly ushered them out of the shrine and back toward the village center. Ife's children were brought to her, and she scooped them up into her arms, kissing their heads and thanking God for their safety. The weight of everything she had been through was overwhelming, but in that moment, with her children safe and Ekene by her side, she felt a glimmer of hope. As they were escorted back to the city, Ife couldn't stop thinking about how much had changed. She had fallen for Akpan's wealth and charm, only to be deceived and nearly destroyed by a ghost. Now, in her darkest hour, it was Ekene, the man she had left behind, who had saved her. And Ekene too had changed. He had become the man he had always promised to be, strong, successful, and now wealthy. His dreams had paid off in a way that Ife had never anticipated. But it wasn't just the money that mattered. It was his loyalty, his unwavering love that struck her the most. As they drove away from the village, Ife glanced at Ekene, her heart full of gratitude and a newfound respect. She had nearly lost everything, but fate, or perhaps grace, had brought her back to him. Now she had a second chance to rebuild her life, and this time she wasn't going to let go of what truly mattered. When they finally reached the city, Ekene helped Ife settle back into her apartment. They sat together, her children playing nearby, and for a moment the world felt calm again. "I'm sorry," Ife said quietly, her voice full of regret. "I was so wrong to leave you." Ekene looked at her with a gentle smile. "We all make mistakes, Ife," he said. "What matters now is that you're safe. We'll figure out the rest from here." Ife nodded, feeling a deep sense of peace for the first time in a long while. She had been through hell and back, but somehow she had found her way back to the man who had never stopped believing in her. And as she sat there, surrounded by the warmth of her family, Ife knew that she had been given a second chance, not just to find happiness, but to find redemption.